Good day, everybody. Welcome to my Monster Hunter Rise weapons video. Specifically, which weapons you should learn, especially if you're a beginner, to either Monster Hunter Rise or the series. Just a bit of background, I'm a longtime Monster Hunter player all the way from the PlayStation Portable to most recently putting a lot of hours into World. And coming into Rise, I feel like one of the biggest strengths of the Monster Hunter installations at this point is also its biggest drawback for new players, and that is the variety of weapons to choose from. There are 14 different weapon types that you can hunt with, and they're all very different, and they each make Monster Hunter feel like a completely different game. So I decided to make this guide to help beginners and experienced hunters alike decide on which weapons you should start with, because it can be overwhelming to just pick one and go with it, especially if you pick one that you don't really like or that's hard to use, and it kind of ruins your experience. So I'm going to go over what I think are the best weapons to learn from like a beginner, intermediate, and experienced perspective. And I'm really ranking these based on my personal experience, based on how fun they are to start out with and how easy they are to learn. And for, at least in my opinion, what the best way is to ease into the more advanced weapons. Depending on which weapons you choose to hunt with, Monster Hunter can be a hack and slash super duper adventure, or it can be a patient timing game, or it can be a crazy series of setting up combos, elaborate combos, and just elaborate things. So your opinion might differ from mine, but this is my suggested progression to just learn all the weapons of Monster Hunter and see what you like. So without further ado, let's get into it. First up is the Sword and Shield. This is a staple of the Monster Hunter series from the very beginning and is, in my opinion, the easiest to learn. It's not used very much, I think, by very high level advanced players because the potential for damage output is not quite there compared to a lot of other weapons, but you can do some pretty good damage as in DPS with this weapon, and it's very balanced. So there's nothing too tricky to it. You have on PC at least, you have your right-click combos, left-click combos. You also have a few more advanced combos that you can get into once you get used to it, but you don't have to use this thing effectively right away. Especially for a new player, there are a lot of advantages that other weapons don't have. For example, a shield, which is not the strongest. Movement, you can move very quickly with your weapon drawn, which does not go for all Monster Hunter weapons. The wire bug combos for this weapon in particular, I noticed compared to other weapon, are absurdly strong. The combo that takes up 2 little wire bugs is really powerful and really wide-ranging. So if you're surrounded by little enemies, or if you just have a window to do a lot of damage, it's pretty crazy actually, and especially early on it can help you finish your hunts faster. The left click wire bug maneuver, I'll call it that, is a little hard to learn since it kind of just launches you into the air, and that is very good for aerial attacks, but the spacing takes some getting used to. The Sword and Shield does have a pretty deadly combo. I forgot what it's called, but it's the one where you step back a little bit and then charge up a series of hits with your Sword and Shield, and then end in climbing onto the monster and hitting it really hard. I didn't get to do that here because this hunt ended really quickly, but the Sword and Shield has been around for a long time, and it'll be most familiar to players who have or are familiar with Dark Souls, Elden Ring, which is a lot of players in 2022. So you can kind of play Dark Souls style with a Sword and Shield pretty easily. If you're coming from that kind of background and you're not too used to Monster Hunter, it's a good starting point. So the Sword and Shield is the first I cover that goes into the category of what I would call beginner weapons. The second beginner weapon that I suggest playing around with is the Greatsword. This one is another staple from the very beginning of Monster Hunter, and it does play very differently than the Sword and Shield. I don't really know what other game styles to relate this to, but I'll tell you my opinion of it. You will spend a lot of your time with your weapon sheathed running around because your movement speed with the Greatsword is pretty terrible. And by the way, you can see me doing a pretty sloppy hunt here. I am just getting back into Monster Hunter after a long break from Monster Hunter World, so I'm figuring this out. But basically, the Greatsword can be fun and satisfying because it revolves all around learning the monster and being able to time your attacks to how the monster behaves. So the real big shtick of the Greatsword is the charged attacks. You sit there, charged up at your attacks. Your charged attacks can chain into other much more powerful attacks if you have the window for it. But in order to pull this off, you'll get some very big hits, as you can see, but you can also see that if you misjudge the way that a monster behaves, you'll get hit back pretty hard. So it's much different than the hack and slash or Dark Souls type of gameplay, and it's very patient, and it's very bigger is better. So if you're using a weapon of like the tier that you're at for your hunts, a lot of your powerful hits will stumble the monster, so it's satisfying in that way. It's, like I said, the idea is it's a different pace entirely than the Sword and Shield or Dual Swords or anything like that, so it's also very easy to use because there are not a whole lot of combos you can do with it. Not even at the very advanced, hunter stage, so give it a try. Next up on the beginner list is the hammer. This is another staple from the very beginning of Monster Hunter, and this has always been one of my favorites. And in Rise, especially compared to other games in the Monster Hunter series, the hammer has gotten some serious buffs and is even more overpowered than it already was. So it plays similarly to the Greatsword in that you rely on few but very big hits, but it's very different and easier to use, I think, compared to the Greatsword, in the sense that your movement speed is great with it, and it's a good introduction to charged attacks and stamina management. The bread and butter of the hammer is the attacks that you use while charging and running around. This drains your stamina, and you can do a number of things. So you can do wire bug attacks, one in particular that is more effective the more charged up you are. You can do a stationary charge attack, and you can do a moving charge attack where you spin around and need a lot better timing. The base attacks of the hammer as well are pretty strong if you get the monster stunned, which will happen frequently. It's just a hard-hitting weapon that is very easy to use. It stuns the monster, which is great for beginner-level hunters to get a few extra free hits. And it is just an all-around very fun weapon to use. The wire bug attacks are very strong and pretty easy to pull off. You will need good timing and all that, but I think they are some of the more useful of all the wire bug attacks. So definitely give this one a try. It's really fun. Next up, and what I would consider on the tail end of beginner weapons for me, is the switch axe. So I never liked this one much in Monster Hunter World, which is the first installment that I used it in. But I am finding in Rise that it is very easy to use and very damaging with very little effort and without even really knowing how to use it. When you get to the late game, at least if this is similar to Monster Hunter World, you'll want to have like elemental builds and all that, have elemental files around your switch axe for it to be most effective, and do that like discharge thing where you latch onto the monster and blow it up. So I don't know if this still applies in the late game is my point with all that, but the point with the switch axe is that it's very easy to use and it's an intro. I think it's a good segue into the charge blade later. The idea, if you're not familiar already, is that there's an axe in a sword form. The axe has better movement, doesn't mean you can move around faster, and has some basic attacks. The sword form is stronger, but you move around slower, similarly to the Greatsword, but with a bit better flexibility. But there's a few added perks, like when you continuously do damage in sword form, you can do this, where you latch onto the monster and then discharge. But you build up charge, essentially, if you use sword form more, and that buffs your attacks in both sword and axe form. And the thing is, the reason why I recommend this as a beginner weapon, even though there's a little bit more nuance to it than the others I talked about, is that all attacks are pretty powerful. You have great mobility, you can do a lot of damage very early on in the game. So especially if you're having trouble with other weapons, it's honestly worth trying out and seeing how you like switching between two different weapon styles. I'll talk more about the charge blade later. I would consider that one an advanced weapon, but I think, like I said, this is a good way to start learning that kind of style and see how you like it. Next up are what I would call intermediate weapons. These are weapons that, in my opinion, are a little more specialized and take a little bit more discovery, let's say, to really figure out and learn. as they have very special use cases, or there's a specific way to use these weapons to be most effective with them, and you don't have as much leeway to play around with them like you do with others. So without further ado, the first one on this list is the Hunting Horn. If you like the hammer, this is a good one to consider, as it's a hammer with a little bit more and a little bit less. A little bit less in the sense that the base attacks aren't so damaging like the hammer, but there's the added bonus that you play music notes on your hunting horn. Basically, if you don't know already, every attack that you do with a hunting horn plays a note, and then you can kind of string these together in a little concert to give yourself buffs and to do extra damage. What I noticed immediately compared to Monster Hunter World is that the playing of the musical notes and the giving yourself buffs has been made much easier. So I don't know how it happens exactly since I'm new to this, but I think if you keep damaging, or at some point if you're just playing really well, that hunting horn icon next to your sharpness will start glowing. And once you do attacks to make the musical melodies that you see there, like self-improvement, health recovery in this case, they'll automatically apply once you play the notes, as opposed to having to play the notes and then do the melody thing to apply them. So they'll apply automatically, in other words, whereas this wasn't the case before in World, and that makes the horn a lot easier to use than before. Another thing is that the wire bug attacks with the horn are very nice, especially for beginners. The one basic one is just basically a charge attack where I believe it negates stun, or at least makes you very immune to stun, and just to deal some high damaging hits. The harder hitting wire bug attack, if you can time it right and if you can get close enough to the monster, does a ton of damage. It attaches the wire bug inside the monster, and then you reverberate into it for a lot of damage. This can very often stun the monster or break parts, so it's great for that. I think it's pretty fun to play, and I think this horn is a lot easier to use than in other Monster Hunter installments. It was typically more of a support weapon, used for its buffs to give the entire team some buffs and then do moderate damage. But I'm seeing in Rise that it's become a much better standalone weapon, and the musical notes are fun to hear. Next up on the intermediates list is the Lance, and I do apologize in advance for the terrible hunting in this video. This is my first time hunting Volvidon, and my first time using a Lance in a very long time, actually, but bear with me here. The Lance is, I would say, a very safe and kind of boring weapon to use for a beginner. Once you're more advanced, you can kind of let go of the shield and confidently just attack. There are no big hitters with the Lance. There's no giant combo or a giant whatever. There are just a bunch of steady, well-damaging hits, which if you become pretty good at hitting weak spots, is actually very strong over time. That's the thing, it's a very safe weapon, especially later when you get into using guard, armor, and all that stuff for all those buffs. It becomes very safe once you can figure out the timing of your blocks versus attacks. Not to mention there's also counter attacks, which are pretty good. There's the charge, the charging attack, which can be very good to cover ground and do damage. And speaking of, the wire bug attacks are interesting for the Lance. Now, the primary one, or the basic one, attaches a kunai inside the monster and allows you to jump to it. One of the biggest pitfalls of the Lance traditionally is being able to cover distance, because you move very slowly with it. But this wire bug attack allows you to jump towards the monster for a while, as long as your kunai is in there, which is a little bit hard to control since the jump is pretty big, but once you get used to it, it becomes pretty good for covering ground. So this is if you're looking for something different. If you're having trouble with a monster at any point and you want to play it safe, getting a Lance and just blocking and attacking when you have openings is a pretty good way to go. I did this a lot in Monster Hunter World when I had trouble with a Lance and with a Gunlance, which leads me to that next. So the Gunlance is essentially it was designed, I think, by someone who really liked a Lance but got bored and wanted some big hitters in there. So if you're not already familiar, it's a Lance with a big gun in it. It's about as difficult to use as a lance, I would say, even though there's a bit more functionality to it. So you have the option of a lot of lance moves if you're familiar with the lance already, and you can also shoot the big gun. There are definitely some advanced gameplay features in here once you get more used to it, like there's a good times to use Wyvern Fire, there's some nice combos you can use, there's the Worm Stake that you can drill into the monster, and not to mention when you get later in the game and you start getting armor with good perks for this, it can become really fun. But even as a beginner level hunter, I would say call this, the only reason really I would call this intermediate is because it's just a weird weapon compared to all the other ones, and it's probably one that you'd be most unfamiliar with, especially if you're new to Monster Hunter. But it is a lot of fun. Your opinion might differ there. There are a lot of things you can do with it, and there are a lot of ways to play with the Gunlance, actually. There are a lot of little perks, too, like the shelling, that's the rounds of ammo or whatever, aren't really affected by sharpness or the monster's armor, so you can do steady damage to any part of the monster that way. Wyvern Fire is definitely a lot of fun. And there's a lot of big combos in there you can do, so this one is worth checking out. Again, up to you. You might want to wait a little bit later until you're more used to the game, or you might just say, what the hell is this, and give it a shot from the very get-go. Could be a lot of fun. Next up are the dual swords. So this one, depending on your general gameplay style and preferences, can be put in the beginner category, but I'll tell you why I put it in intermediate. In the very beginning of the game, in my opinion, dual swords are very weak. This is another weapon that benefits a lot from elemental damage, so you'll need to wait until you're later in the game to start getting a lot of elemental boosts. And to make the most out of them, at least in previous Monster Hunter series, you pretty much need a build for every element type to do max damage with it. But all that aside, you can still play fairly effectively with them. I also call them intermediate because of my personal gameplay preferences, and I do not prefer the hack and slash type of game. If you do, and if you prefer to be constantly just mashing at the monsters, then this probably is actually the best beginner weapon for you. Here's the deal with the dual swords, if you're not already familiar. You do very little damage per hit, but you get a lot of hits in there. The bread and butter is this demon mode that you get into. It just drains your stamina constantly while you're in there, but while you're in demon mode, you do a lot of damage. While you continuously do damage in demon mode, you fill up your demon meter and enter archdemon mode to do even more damage. So it is like the peak hack and slash. It reminds me of those Dynasty games where you're just slashing around and killing thousands of enemies at once. Except it's just one big enemy here, but there are some interesting things. The wire bugs moves I don't find particularly useful. They play very much like in the other Monster Hunter games. To me, that's all I have to say about them, really. They're nice. They are definitely a lot of fun, but they are just very crazy. And like I said, they become much more useful later in the game. So if you like this style of gameplay, go for it. If not, I would say it's better to wait till later until you can have entire builds around these weapons. Then they actually become some of the best weapons you can use. Next up on the intermediate list are the projectile weapons, starting with the bow. So ever since the bow was introduced into Monster Hunter, it saw a lot of use and a lot of appreciation. I call this one intermediate. It could be beginner depending on your playstyle, mainly because it's very different than most other weapons in Monster Hunter, which are melee weapons. And melee weapons are kind of the bread and butter of the whole game. You can get used to using a bow, especially if you're unfamiliar, and find some happiness with it, but similarly to the dual swords, they rely very much on hitting very often, very fast, very frequently, and specifically on hitting weak points. That's another reason why I put it in the intermediate category. Bows are pretty useless if you're not hitting the monster's weakest point. The Royal Ludroth is a good example where essentially the head, not even the mane or the neck, but the head is really the only spot you can hit to do any kind of decent damage. I think that's a little bit hard for a beginner player, especially if you're not used to this kind of gameplay, and you'll just end up getting a lot of weak hits. But bows are great weapons to get used to. You can have your entire counter build around them very successfully once you're used to them. They are some of the top tier weapons as well. And again, these weapons benefit mostly from elemental damage, so the later you get into the game and the more elemental builds you come up with, the more fun, the more effectiveness you'll have with the bow. So they are great weapons overall. Again, I just call them intermediate because I think it's good to get used to other weapons first. There are a lot of nuances from beginner gameplay to advanced combos with this, and that we won't get into, but yeah, there's plenty of room to grow here with this. Next up are the bowguns, starting with the light bowgun. So as of this installment, and I mean maybe even world you could say, bowguns can really hold their own as solo primary weapons. In past Monster Hunter installments, they've been really kind of support weapons, and they've been almost impossible to use solo. But starting with the light bowgun here, it's pretty effective. You can move around pretty quickly, you can do decent damage. One of the perks of bowguns is that each one deals differently with different ammo. Let me explain that better. For example, this bowgun here, which is just the champion bowgun, one of the starter ones, has rapid fire with normal ammo 1 and 2, which means it'll fire multiple shots per round, which is good because once you start using bowguns, you need to start worrying about stocking ammo. There are many kinds of bowgun ammo that are in short supply. The only unlimited ammo you have is normal 1, which is pretty much useless even at early game. I don't recommend using it. So that's one of the two reasons that I call this an intermediate weapon, the light and heavy bowgun. You have to start managing ammo, which if you absolutely love shooters and that's your main history, maybe as a gamer, that's not a bad thing, but you will be constantly foraging for supplies to make ammo, and in the early game, that's just kind of difficult. One thing I do like about the light bowgun is the little special move here, I think it's called a worm stake, the little thing that shoots into the ground. That does extra damage if it is hit while anything is near it. I feel very similarly about the heavy bowgun with a few differences. I don't need to speak for now, just watch. So obviously there are some benefits to the heavy bowgun over the light bowgun and over other weapons. What you saw there was the special ammo. Heavy bowguns will have either what you just saw, which I forget the name of, but it's the like rapid fire thing that actually increases with damage as you use it more. That just recharges over time. As the name implies, heavy bowguns deal more damage per hit or per ammo, so that can be good for ammo conservation, especially early game. You do move more slowly while you have a heavy bowgun out, but the dodging range is actually much bigger than with any other weapon, so that can be kind of nice. With heavy and light bowguns, you can attach different, well, they're called attachments to them. With the heavy bowgun in particular, can have either, for example, a heavy barrel to get longer range or more damage, or a shield to auto guard when appropriate. So for that reason, these are very good weapons to use, but I call them intermediate because there's a lot more to worry about. Bowgun customization is a whole bag of worms and just an extra thing to have to pay attention to as a beginner hunter. So yeah, these weapons are great, but I would recommend getting used to the melee weapons first and then see how you like bowguns. Last up on my totally intermediate list is the Insect Glaive. This actually was my favorite for a while in World. It's not the most popular weapon, because I think in the end game you can't get the most meta super damage build out of it, or you know, whatever. But I think it's a lot of fun for a lot of reasons. However, it is a bit more difficult to learn than a sword and shield or something like that. So the Insect Glaive relies on the Kinsect attached to it, which is a whole bag of worms in itself. You can buy and upgrade different types of Kinsects that do different types of things, but the essentially is... what am I doing? Essentially, the thing is, at the beginning of a fight, you'll want to send out your Kinsect to hit different parts of the monster you're hunting and come back to you with extract. Different parts of the monsters get different parts of extract that you can see next to your sharpness gauge as 1, 2, 3. Generally speaking, attacking or extracting insect extract from the head of the monster will give you the attack boost in the 1 slot. Number 2 there is movement that can come from either the body or legs of the monster. It kind of varies. The head, body, and limbs of the monster are generally what you need to hit to get different insect extracts. Now, why that's important is that without these insect extracts, the glaive is actually pretty weak. It becomes very strong once you get at least number 1 and 2 in there, which is your attack power and like speed, or it changes the way that your attacks go, especially your aerial attacks. You hit more often, faster, and for more damage. Once you have all the insect extract there, your insect glaive has plenty of very strong attack options on the ground. The right click here is a series of 3 very powerful hits. The left click is quicker, weaker hits, but that are easier to break out of. And of course, there's the aerial hits. I found that especially as a more beginner hunter, if you're not used to a monster yet and you're still learning what it does, you can avoid a lot of attacks by being in the air and just maintaining air attacks as you kind of figure out what it does and see what its hit radius is and all that stuff. So I think it's a very versatile weapon. You can stay on the ground, you can stay in the air, you can shoot it with your insect, whatever it is you're hunting. The only bad time to use an insect glaive, I would say, is if you're hunting small monsters, like one of those missions. Because like I said, it's very weak unless you get all of the insect extract, and small monsters don't really provide all of it. All in all, I would consider the glaive a very balanced weapon actually, and I would highly recommend getting into it. It also doesn't have like that many combos, so there's nothing super crazy to learn about it. I do highly recommend it. Now this leaves us with only 2 weapons for the advanced list, which I realize is a bit wonky, so bear with me as I make up this list on the fly, but the first of those, which could be considered intermediate or even beginner, as it's the very first weapon you're equipped with after you do the tutorial, is the Longsword. Now, there are a lot of reasons why I put this on the advanced list, and namely because to be most effective with the Longsword, it takes a lot of very specialized learning with especially the counterattacks and the filling up the spirit gauge. You can use this weapon as a beginner. Essentially, it's pretty versatile and it's pretty quick and all that stuff, but it's not very effective unless you learn to fill up the spirit gauge very efficiently. You can do this by the whole big, I don't even know what to call it. On the mouse, it's like the side button combo where you slash around a lot. That fills up the spirit gauge. What also fills up the spirit gauge is successfully counter-attacking, which in my experience is quite an advanced skill. It takes a lot to get the timing right for the counterattack feature of the Longsword. So, like I said, that's why in my opinion I wouldn't really mess with it till later. You can try it early on and see how you feel about it. It's just that you need to maintain that spirit gauge for it to be any kind of effective, and that can be just a lot to manage for a beginner. But it is one of the, well, I keep saying this weapon and that weapon is one of the best weapons you can use, but the Longsword is actually like the highest tier, at least as of world, and I'm pretty sure it's the same here, that you can use as far as DPS and fastest skills and all that stuff. Lastly, and at the tippy top of my advanced list, is the Charge Blade. Now, I did have a build around, or several builds around Charge Blades in World. It has been a while, so apologies for the rustiness here. But I put this at the very tippy top of the advanced weapons because it is, along with the Longsword, I think one of the other like top tier weapons you can use once you get used to it. There are just a lot of things to learn here. It's not a very efficient weapon to use if you don't really know what you're doing and you're just bumbling around. At low beginner level, you can just kind of mess around with it, but the more you get into the game, the more you'll find out that you really need to know how to use this thing to be effective. So there's a sword and shield mode, which is familiar for using the sword and shield. There's the big axe mode, which if you use like the switch axe before or whatever, you'll be familiar with. So I kind of recommend learning it after all those things, just so you already have a feel for that type of gameplay. But what really sets this weapon apart is charging the files. So a rundown, if you're not familiar, you charge the files in sword and shield mode, and then you charge the shield, and then you switch to axe mode and use that, and then I actually don't know how to do all this stuff in Rise yet. I only knew in World, but you can essentially charge further and do an amped element discharge, which is like a super duper big hit. You can also, instead of that, charge the sword after you've charged the files a bunch of times, and then get a bunch of bonus attacks that way. There are a lot of options for this thing, and it's pretty complicated to get to that point and charge the right amount of charges and charge the right thing, and to charge the sword you have to like interrupt in a certain attack. Anyways, it's really cool and it is a lot of fun once you learn it, but I absolutely don't recommend it for a beginner or even intermediate player. I recommend playing around with it as early on as you can, but I don't recommend making a serious build around this until you're much later in the game. So it is a great weapon, and it is very versatile once you learn how to use it. I just think learning how to use it is much more difficult compared to other weapons. So that's all, guys. That's all 14 weapons in Monster Hunter Rise. I hope there was some clarity in what I said here, and I hope that it does help you decide what kind of weapon you want to use, especially based on maybe what other games you're familiar with, or if you're coming from Monster Hunter World or other Monster Hunter installments, just getting a feel for how these weapons have changed. If you want to see more content like this, please subscribe. I will definitely make more, and like I said, I am a total beginner to Rise, so as I play more, I will come up with more content and more guides, I'm sure. So, until the next one, enjoy, and I'll catch you guys later. Thanks for watching.